Hello and welcome to the Rabyd Atheist. I'm Ed Rabyd, a former pastor turned atheist, now compassionate anti-theist. Welcome to my channel. Feel free to like or dislike the videos you see fit, so feel free to hit those buttons. Feel free to comment below, and I would appreciate it if you'd subscribe to the channel and hit your notification bell for more content as it is released. You're also free to share my videos as much as you like, because the purpose of this channel is educational in regards to atheist and deconversion issues and any issues related to those issues. Hearty shout out to the Rabyd Nation. Join the nation by hitting that subscribe button. And if you want to support the channel in a more tangible way, hit the join button, and your membership options, which will lead to citizenship in the Rabyd Nation, will be presented to you. Today I want to react to a video titled, "What are the proofs for the resurrection?" Given that it's Holy Week and we're kind of dealing with Christians all going to their churches and celebrating the resurrection of Jesus Christ, I figured that it would be a good time to react to somebody. And I tried to find somebody with a little bit of clout, and this is from Seminary, and this is a guy, actually a doctor, a professor of apologetics. So we're going to kind of see what he does and how he goes forward with his proofs for the resurrection. So without any further ado, let's get started.
The word proofs is a loaded term in philosophy, and in many cases people will push back at us for using that in the Christian faith. But the Bible itself, Acts 1:3, says that with many convincing proofs, Jesus appeared to his disciples for 40 days after his resurrection.
Okay, so we're going to start out with the fact that this is Dr. Theodore Cabal. He's a professor of Christian apologetics at Seminary. So those are his street creds. I'm Ed Rabyd, the Rabyd Atheist. My cred is I have a master's degree in theological study from Asbury Theological Seminary, I have a degree in biblical studies from Trinity Bible College in Ellendale, North Dakota. And both of those degrees are accredited, and I'm sure his are as well. So we're dealing with a couple educated people here looking at quote-unquote proofs of the resurrection. Right away, I don't really understand why the idea that there's this idea of pushback against the idea of proofs within the Christian faith or outside the faith. The Christian faith makes many historical claims, and proofs to those claims would be gold, let's be honest. If there is such pushback, then it is probably by people who fear what could be said about such proofs. Now, you bring up Acts 1:3. Yeah, it says that it gives them proof but one. The book of Acts, which has zero historical verification, it is truly hearsay in the Bible, and a great example of hearsay, of historical hearsay. We don't have any verification for it. We really only have the fact that it's probably volume 2 of whoever wrote Luke. Luke Acts is kind of a 2-volume set, and that much is pretty much verified, but we really don't know who wrote it, and we really don't know where they were getting their stories. Okay, so we have the Bible telling us that Jesus gave many proofs, but we don't really have any of those proofs listed. That's the other problem. Why aren't these proofs listed? Even if we are using Luke, then those stories don't have any historical verification either. What would have been nice is a list of those proofs at this point in the book of Luke, although he's probably trying to say that his whole 2-volume set is the proofs. The problem is the writer of Luke never bothers to verify his historical sources, which they did back then when they had eyewitnesses and things. They would often name them, but Luke doesn't do that in either his gospel or Acts. It would have been nice to have a listed name of people who saw Jesus Christ, and they were also historically verified to have said it in other places. That would have been very convincing to us today. Now, a lot of people would argue, yeah, but people wouldn't know what would happen. Yeah, but God would know, and if this is an important message to God, he would have understood that later on in the history of the world, people were going to ask for better proofs than what were being offered. And he would have probably found a way to get that into his supposed, inspired word of God. But let's see where you go with this.
In fact, the apostles were faced with this accusation that they had actually stolen the body of Jesus. And so, as early as the New Testament, all the way to this present day, there have been attacks on the notion that Jesus was raised from the dead. And through the next almost 2,000 years, if we were to come up to today, there are a series of what we call counter theories to the resurrection. The resurrection of Jesus through the centuries has responded to these counter theories, such as, well, his body was stolen, or maybe he wasn't really dead when he was put in the tomb, and so on, have been responded to powerfully, such that I'm convinced today the very best answer is, in fact, rationally, that Jesus was historically raised from the dead.
Yeah, there have been a lot of counter theories to the resurrection, but the fact that they exist, and if you could debunk them, does not actually prove your claim. Your claim is that Jesus rose from the dead. Okay, just because there are other people that question whether or not Jesus was actually dead, whether or not, different things come up, that might throw some wrench into the Christian claim. The counter arguments aren't actually your claim or proving your claim. You're just kind of defending your claim, which is fine as far as it goes, but you still haven't offered any actual proof that for the claim that you're making, that Jesus being resurrected doesn't win by default because all the other claims are shot down. You still have to prove that claim. I'm actually very interested, and I was very interested in seeing what proofs were going to be offered for the resurrection of Jesus, not how the counterclaims are debunked or dealt with. And what we'll see what actually happens, what Mr. Theodore does here at this point. But let's continue on.
Now, some of the actual historical evidences that have been discussed through the centuries are that Jesus was really dead. That is to say, there's no question that he just swooned when he was put into the tomb. The Romans knew how to kill you when they crucified you.
Yeah, no doubt the Romans knew how to kill people. Okay, they were very efficient at crucifixion. So I've never really bought the swoon theory. I figured that if Jesus was a real person, that if he was crucified by the Romans, they did a good job and killed him. I really have no argument against this one. I never liked it anyway, and it's not one that I would use to disprove the theory of the resurrection. I mean, in order to have a resurrection, we do have to have an actual dead body. Jesus has to be dead and then raised from the life. So let's just grant that one for the sake of argument. It's not one that I hear very often anymore. So the value of bringing it up doesn't really have a lot of value. The issue is not whether Jesus died so much as whether, did he rise from the dead? Let's concede that he died and that the Romans knew how to kill people. So let's move on.
2, the fact is that his tomb was empty. The early Christians even lost where the actual tomb is. We don't know for sure even where you're taken as a tourist today is actually where he was buried. Why? Because they didn't care about it. He was raised from the dead. His enemies would have presented his body were he actually still in the tomb.
Yeah, the problem with the empty tomb, though, is it's purely for the Bible tells you so. And it doesn't tell it well, okay? This is not the first time that I've heard the idea that early Christians didn't really care about the empty tomb because Jesus was raised from the dead, and so they didn't really give it any credence. The problem with that is the biblical accounts themselves. If they didn't really care about the empty tomb, then why do the gospel writers spend so much time putting one into the story later, particularly seeing that Mark doesn't really have one, but Matthew and Luke make a big deal about the empty tomb, and so does John. Okay, why do they tell us who it really belonged to, this Joseph of Arimathea, that we also have no historical verification for, and go through the story of him getting the body and taking the body down, and him and Nicodemus burying the body in a very hastily manner and putting it into his tomb, which is a brand new one? If they didn't care about the tomb, why do the gospel writers seem to care so much about it? Let's be honest here. Apologists would be salivating if the tomb of Jesus Christ, where Jesus Christ was buried, could be verified. It would have been a holy site very early on, and people would have pointed to it, especially if the inscription on it indicated that it belonged to Joseph of Arimathea, or the Christians had carved into its walls, this is the place where Jesus was buried, okay? It would be like finding Alexander the Great Father's tomb with the inscription on it. Trust me, apologists would love to have this kind of verification of where the tomb was buried, because right now, all they have is the Bible says it was an empty tomb. That doesn't prove that Jesus was buried in one or anything else. You need a whole bunch of other things. As for Jesus' enemies would have produced his body, I'm not sure if that would be possible if Jesus was, like the vast majority of crucifixion victims, buried in a mass grave. This explanation offers an alternative why Jesus' body was never presented and never found, and it could be given, as why they wouldn't present it. Okay, it's, would be very difficult to identify somebody buried in a mass grave as being distinct from somebody else. And why would anybody go through the trouble of exhuming a body from a mass grave? That would be kind of messy, and you wouldn't be able to find out which one was Jesus. Not to mention the fact that if the disciples did indeed steal the body and hide it, how could the enemies of Jesus have presented it if they were not in possession of it, but the disciples had it and knew where it was? I've never understood, that this is a bad thing, a disciple stole the body, because it still doesn't, even Matthew doesn't really address it. He tries to say that the tomb was really sufficiently guarded, and things like that. But that doesn't change the fact that the body could have still been stolen and hidden by the disciples. And if they did, then the enemies of Jesus wouldn't have had it. Okay, so that doesn't make any sense for me either. Okay, so, or anybody else. I've never really understood this objection to this idea because it's quite still plausible. Just because Matthew says that it's a false story and that it exists to that day at the time of his writing doesn't change the fact that it could still be true. Okay, plus, I don't know if Jesus' enemies would have produced him if he had been buried in a mass grave. Why would they bother? Everybody saw him die and everybody saw him get buried in a mass grave. So why would that be an issue? But we'll see if you got anything else.
3, his disciples believed that they were seeing Jesus after his resurrection, that is, in a post-mortem raised state, so much so that they were willing to die for this. This is remarkable. And in fact, they changed for their belief system. These early believers were Jewish, and so they began to worship on the first day of the week, that is Sunday, instead of the Sabbath day. They celebrated the Lord's Supper, which is a proclamation of his death and burial and resurrection until he comes, and baptism, which was a symbol of buried with him in the likeness of his death and raised in the likeness of his resurrection.
Well, the problem is once you try to actually get the verifications of the apostles' death, you really have a hard time, okay? There's no really good ancient sources that verify the existence of any of the apostles after the Gospels. In fact, 10 of them pretty much disappear, and the other 2 kind of hang around, like Peter and John, but it doesn't really prove that they died for their faith. Also, the notion that they died for their faith is purely made up, okay? Even Seth McDowell had to say he backed off of this, that he no longer says that all the apostles died for their faith, because when he started to look at the actual historical verification of that, he didn't really have that either. And it's the question of dying for their faith. Okay, that's the big question. Did they die for their faith or were they just killed? Even James in the book of Acts, when he is killed, okay, John's brother, it never says he died because he believed in his resurrection and wouldn't recant. What it says is that Herod killed him and he saw that it pleased the Jews. And so it was more political than religious. And there's nothing in that story that tells us that James was given an opportunity to recant for his faith and wouldn't do it. It doesn't say that. And that's pretty much true of all the rest of the apostles. There is no proof of the assertion that they died not willing to recant, and that has zero evidence. And that's why a lot of apologists don't use it anymore, because they know that this objection is going to be brought up. There's no evidence that they actually died for their faith. Also, the fact that early Christians who have been Jewish changed or engaged in additional religious practices also doesn't prove the resurrection either. Communion actually says nothing about the resurrection. That was a nice add-on there, but the fact is, when you look at the communion ritual, it is very much about the significance of the sacrifice of Jesus' death. It has very, very little to do with the resurrection, okay? Even when I was a Christian and I would celebrate communion, I realized this fact, okay, that there was, Paul doesn't even mention the idea of resurrection in 1 Corinthians. A lot of pastors use that passage when they do communion. But it doesn't really say that it's about the resurrection. Baptism was also about proselytization before the Christians got a hold of it. it was about coming into the Jewish faith, and there was no mention of the resurrection to new life at that point. It doesn't take on any significance with the resurrection until Christians endow it with that meaning when they continue the practice. The fact that we have this idea of resurrection of new life is actually, kind of a Christian idea that they kind of imposed on the symbol of baptism. And this leads to the final objection to this idea. The fact that a group of people sincerely believe something to the point of changing how they're doing their religious practices is not earth-shaking. It happens in every religion all the time. It suddenly doesn't prove what they believe to be true as true, only that they just believe it enough to change the way they do things religiously. So once again, you're doing a lot of these counterclaims. You're trying to debunk the counterclaims, but that still hasn't proven anything. And the things that you have kind of hinted that might be proof aren't really all that great a proof yet. But we'll see where you go.
Interestingly enough, the various theories like swoon or conspiracy or they lost the body and so on, only a handful of these are still used today by skeptics. And the irony is they fail miserably simply to deal with what now the majority of New Testament scholars, even those who are not Christians, agree on those historical facts that I presented.
Yes, it is interesting that you bring up old criticisms of the death and resurrection that most people don't really care about anymore. Even when you made this video, which was many years ago, they didn't really care about them. That said, you still haven't offered up any proof yourself, nor have you engaged a lot of the new and more sophisticated theories. I think the idea of minimal witnesses and the fact that post-traumatic, death appearances are actually quite common, and a few other things here because of the trauma and psychology and the fact that it doesn't really take a whole bunch. You really haven't engaged. Nobody's really engaged my theory of how quickly scuttlebutt goes through a Pentecostal church. Why wouldn't it be any different for the early Christians, where miracle stories are easily believed? A couple people tell the story and everybody believes it. Well, I trust that person, so what they say must be true, even though there's no historical evidence for it. You make the mistake here that just because you have debunked all these counter theories, that's proof of what you say is being true. And that's not it. You have to prove your own claim. You don't just get to Jesus' resurrection of the gaps into a spot just because you think there's no other alternative explanation. The fact is there's a lot of alternative explanations, and you really haven't addressed many of them. Answering objections is fine. That's part of the business of ideas. When somebody proposes something and somebody has objection to that idea, yeah, you're supposed to respond to those objections. But that doesn't prove your claim. And this video is titled, "What are the proofs of the resurrection?" Not what are the counter proofs to the proofs that the resurrection didn't happen. Those are two different things. And you don't automatically win this argument by default just because you dismiss all the other arguments, which is interesting. You've dismissed a lot of old ones and not a lot of new ones. And you've kind of avoided offering up any proof yourself, at least so far to this point. But we'll see if that continues.
The bottom line is the significance of the resurrection of Jesus is intensely personal. The reason is simply that if he's not raised from the dead, then Christianity is silly. There's no forgiveness for our sins. My having lived my life believing that he's raised from the dead was a waste. I could have lived it any other of a number of ways. But if he is raised from the dead, then in fact, the hundreds of millions of people who've trusted in him through the centuries really do have hope for eternal life.
Well, I'm glad you acknowledge that the resurrection isn't true. If it isn't true, then Christianity is silly and a waste of time. I've been trying to say that on my channel at the end of every video for years. Now, I would also agree that if it is true, then it would have some significance, although it is not proof that Jesus is the Son of God, seeing that the Gospels also claim that other people were raised from the dead, including a host of people when Jesus actually died. So being raised from the dead seems to be a very common thing in the New Testament. So I'm not saying how you can significantly say that this proves Jesus is God's Son and that it should have significance for your faith and for your life as a Christian. There seems to be a rash of resurrection stories in the New Testament, including the Big Mass one. As Christopher Hitchens so eloquently pointed out, this means that resurrection is far more common. Jesus Christ wasn't the only one who experienced resurrections. So why does that prove that he's the Son of God, and that doesn't prove these other people are sons or daughters of God, okay, in the same significant way? So even if true, there are some significant questions that still are left about Jesus and who he was. The resurrection doesn't prove any of that. I'm a little worried, based on what you said, that this is going to turn out to be an argument from personal experience, as you mentioned it right off the top of this segment. But let's see.
I remember 43 years ago when I was not a Christian, 20-year-old pagan, hated Christianity, yet woke up on Easter morning with a bad hangover as a hippie with long hair. God has a sense of humor, it seems. I had been told recently by Christians that on Easter, that was the day they celebrated Jesus having been raised from the dead. And the fundamental question of life that I was facing, like, is there a God, and could I be forgiven for the evil that I actually was fully caught up in and was convinced I was guilty of? Could I be forgiven? I didn't connect all those dots, but something bothered me that morning. This is the day Jesus rose from the dead.
So the significant proof that you offer was your own personal experience. I'm very disappointed at this point in the video. You didn't number one, you didn't really offer up any proofs for the resurrection, certainly not convincing ones, just counters to some of the other claims against it, which you say nobody really offers anymore, which some of them not true. Just proving counterclaims does not prove your claim. Two, even my apologetics professor when I was in Bible college stated quite boldly in a Pentecostal school that personal experience proves nothing. He lives within my heart, or the feeling of significance some Christian told you a story and you chose to believe it because it gives you personal value, has no value to prove anything. A, you can't repeat it to others or share your experience in the same way you experienced it. And B, you're assuming your interpretation of your experience is correct and infallible. 3, dude, you're an apologetics professor. At least when you were when you made this video, you should at least know the difference between answering objections and offering up proof for claim, and you should also know that proof that personal experience proves nothing. Hindus have personal experiences. Islamic people have personal experiences. Anybody who's in religious has personal experiences. So is that proof for theirs? Did somehow, when this person woke up and they heard Islamic people telling the story of Muhammad and how he received the revelation of the Quran, and somehow that became personally insignificant to them, that's proof of the resurrection? Come on, man. This is kind of disappointing, but maybe you'll find a way to save it at the end. But, I'm not holding out a lot of hope at this point.
And that's what makes Christianity so very special. The love of God displayed in the death, burial, resurrection of Jesus for us has been demonstrated to be true. And that's what gives me hope. And it should you too if you belong to Him.
So a bunch of people believe in something and it has significance for their lives. And that's proof of the resurrection. When I picked out this video and I saw that it was a doctor at the beginning and a professor at a seminary, I thought it would have some meat to it, but this is pretty weak sauce. Actually, I became quite disappointed in this video. But at the same time, I decided to still do the reaction because, well, it's pretty much apologetics in a nutshell when they talk about the resurrection. They don't really offer up any proofs. In fact, I could probably use countless examples much like this where somebody talks about the significance to the early believers, which is a mass personal experience, or they want to talk about all the counterclaims to Jesus being resurrected and all this other stuff, and somehow that's significant. I don't understand this notion that somehow, you're going to get this big old thing where, God does this stuff and somehow personal experience matters to them, okay? Or if you just counter all the other claims and suddenly your claim wins by default. This is an apologetics trope. And what's more disappointing is this video is still up. It's still part of Southern Seminary's YouTube channel, and they still look at it as a pretty significant thing. Now, I don't get it. If you're going to prove the resurrection, you better come with better A game than this, because if this is your A game, you've got a problem. Because I don't think that you're going to end up convincing anybody with this one. Disappointed, big word, but expected too, because this is the state of apologetics. This is a professor. This is a guy who has a doctorate in front of his name. I don't know in what, maybe philosophy, something. I mean, if I looked it up, I might be disappointed at that. I'm also fairly certain that this individual probably had to sign a statement of faith to work at Southern Seminary, because it sounds like the place that, whenever you have a seminary or Bible college and you work there, they always want to have you sign the statement of faith. So even if you understood objections that could be used in significance, you probably wouldn't present them because you'd be afraid for your job. It's the statements of faith that really kind of pigeonhole people into believing certain things, and they're quite dishonest. And I really wish that seminaries and Bible colleges would get rid of them, but I don't think they ever will. Well, that kind of wraps up this one. Once again, disappointed. No proofs for the resurrection, just a lot of counter arguments, and some of them not very good ones. So there's that. And then, disappointed by the creds not really leading to anything different than what I hear from other apologists without the creds. So here we go. Well, once again, thanks for stopping by. I appreciate every like, share, and subscribe. Thank you once again for being here and doing what you do. It really helps grow the channel. I also want to give a shout out to my members. These are the people that make this channel really work. It allows me to do some of the videos I do without the like, shares, and subscribes that I normally get with some of my other videos, but are helping people deconvert. And so thank you to my members for those things that help people deconvert. And as always, live your best life. You only get one go around. There is no resurrection from the dead. So therefore, you want to spend all your time, your money, and opportunities in building up yourself, building the relationships with people you love and care for, and making this a better world. And don't waste them on the trappings of religion and faith, because as this professor said, if this isn't true, it's really silly and a waste of time. And I agree with him, because it isn't true, and it is silly and a waste of time. So you don't want to do that. You'll be much happier if you're being more productive with your time, your energy, and opportunities. I speak from experience. And as always, thanks for stopping by, and I'll catch you next time.